Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Power Core Productions and Podcastings. I'm your host, Jerron Harrington, back to hit you another video, and today we're going to be getting into a new series in a My Hero Academia What If, and this is one that I've been dabbling with for a while now, and I really liked the premise, but I wasn't sure if I could pull it off, but after going through this story, I really am looking forward to doing this one. And this is What If Deku Was the Son of Rock Lee, My Hero Academia Fighting Spirit. Now, this story is definitely going to be one that puts everything on its head. For starters, a lot of characters who don't get much screen time are going to get it here. You see, with this story and with a lot of other stories that I do on my channel, I like to stand out, and I like to do things a little bit differently than your average what if YouTuber. I want my stories to have a meaning, to truly go beyond just being a fanfic. I want it to be something that can truly move and be something that resonates with people. And I feel like this story has the capability of doing so. And also, I feel like it's a chance to explore different power sets in different universes. And I figure, why not give Rock Lee a bit of a shine? I mean, when you look at him in the grand scheme of things in Naruto, he's the kind of guy who kind of hit his peak in part 1. I mean, he had flashes in part 2 if you want to call it that, but he really doesn't do very much, and he's pretty much non-existent in Boruto. But I don't put that on, the series of Boruto. I mean, Rock Lee was made irrelevant in Shippuden, for crying out loud, so there's not really much else that you can do there. But I want to try to tell a story that can be different, one that can stand on its own, and one that can be unique in terms of the My Hero Academia universe. There are stories about what if Deku had chakra, and you could say that this is a version of that, although I'm taking it in a much different direction in terms of how he gets chakra and in terms of how he uses it. I want Deku to be his own hero, to be unique, and to be something special. Also, like I've done in my other story with Deku, in this one, I really don't want to give him one for all if possible. So I am going to be letting you guys vote down below if you guys want him to have one for all. If you do, and if you don't, tell me who you think should get the power, but I'll be having you guys vote, so keep that in mind. But anyway, we're going to get into today's video. So, as always, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Things happen for a reason. At least, that's what we like to believe in our lives. We like to believe that everything we've been through, everything we've gone through, was all for a purpose, that it was all for a reason. Many people question, what is fate? Is fate something that you can control? Or is fate something that's predestined? Is it something that can never change? Is it something that was already written the day that you were born, or maybe even before then? For our story, we follow such a hero who grips with such a dilemma. For many, you know him as Rock Lee, a Konoha shinobi. In this universe, Rock Lee died tragically, following the events of the Sasuke retrieval arc. He was slain in battle going up against Kimimaro. He attempted to do so to buy Naruto time to go and bring Sasuke back, but unfortunately, he had not completely overcome his injuries, and as such, he and Kimimaro Both perished in their fight, Gaara arriving in time, only to see the final outcome. As Rock Lee lay dying, as he faded away from this world, he would look to see that he were floating in a void, a place he couldn't recognize, until finally he heard a voice from where he did not know. This voice told him that his time was not yet, that there were still many great things that he must do. For Lee, he was unsure, as he had no way of knowing what or who this voice was. The last thing he had remembered was that he had died in battle. But he was told that he would be given another chance. He would be reborn in a new world. A world different from his own. A world that he would have to make his home, and a world that he must defend. Lee wasn't entirely sure of what was going on, but to hear that he would have another chance at life was more than what he could ask for. He would be warned that this would be his last chance. Something like this doesn't happen for everyone, much less happen twice. Lee would be grateful, and with that, he would find himself falling into a trance once again, before he would awaken. Unknown to Lee, he had arrived in another universe. The universe of My Hero Academia, 15 years before the start of the series. As Lee would awaken, he would be lying on the ground. He would be in the middle of a park of a city in Japan called Musutafu. He had no idea how he had gotten here. Thankfully, the language used in Japan, the writing, was akin to his own from the world that he had come from. So at the very least, he could read and understand everything around him. But seeing tall buildings, a large park, cars, people dressed a little funny for his liking. In the world of Naruto, common to many beliefs, there were some technologies that did exist. Things like electricity, lights, even television. There were movies and films. But of course, compared to the world that he was in, his world was more primitive. If the world that he had come from was futile at best, well, this world was something out of a dream. Lee walked around. He was unsure of where he was. On top of everything, he was still dressed from how he remembered. He was still in his green jumpsuit, along with his headband tied around his waist. His shuriken holster and his kunai pouch were all in the same place. His legs still had the thigh wrap. His legs were also still adorned with his ankle weights, and he still had his leg warmers and sandals, and his arms were properly bandaged. Although the arm and leg that had been crushed and that suffered so much damage, it felt healed. It felt as though he had never been in that fight with Gaara in the first place. Lee walked around and staggered, dodging traffic and going in and out, as he had no idea where he was going or what he was doing at this point. As he made his way down the street, he would come across a girl that looked about his age. She had her hair tied up. It was green, and she looked pretty cute. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bump into you. I have no idea where I am. Can you help me? Oh, sure. Are you new here? Yeah, actually, I'm from another world. Do you guys have ninja? Ninja? Maybe game show? I'm sorry. I don't know. Who are you exactly? Oh, my name is Rock Lee. Well, actually, Rock Lee is just the short for my full name. It's Ryuko Lee, but, people call me Rock Lee for short. Um, who are you? Oh, my name is Inko. I'm, Inko Midoriya. Nice to meet you. Ah, nice to meet you, Inko. Um, can you please tell me, where am I exactly? Um, you're in Masutofu, Japan. I'm sorry. I mean, you look like you're a native from here, but you're lost? Are you from somewhere else? Oh, yes, I'm from Konoha. Please tell me, do you know where Konoha is? Um, I'm sorry, I've never heard of a Konoha. If you'll excuse me, I really gotta go. Lee wanted to ask her more questions, but unfortunately, she had things that she had to do, and she wasn't entirely sure about him. She made her way down an alley as she usually did to head home, but unknown to her, there were two other beings who were waiting for her. Two shady looking men. One who had the quirk to turn his fingers into switchblades, and the other who had the distinct ability to shoot sticky webbing from his fingertips. They were common thugs and nothing more, and Rock Lee noticed them as they followed her down the alley. He quickly followed suit. Using his shinobi skills, he made sure to keep his presence hidden. The men would corner Inko in the alley, looking to rob her and who knows what else. However, as Inko was afraid, as her quirk wasn't anything special, she had no real way of defending herself and there weren't any heroes close by. She tried to call out, but she was quickly webbed up and her mouth was covered with webbing. The rather larger set guy who had the web quirk was keen to try to keep his hostage tied up in the meantime, while the one with the switchblade took to rummaging through her bag. Inko closed her eyes, hoping that someone would come and rescue her. In a flash of green, something would move in a blur. No one knew what was happening in the alley. The thugs were quickly dispatched of easily, as the yell of Leaf Wind Hurricane echoed throughout the alley. The two of them easily being dispatched of, before Lee would undo the bindings and help get Inko out of there. Inko was absolutely stunned. She had no idea who this guy was, but he had skill. She wasn't sure what type of quirk he had, but he had strength, but he had speed also. It kind of reminded her of All Might. She would stop and ask Lee about his quirk. How was he able to do what he did? And Lee looked at her confused. He asked her what a quirk was, and she had to think that, was he just playing with her at this point? Some guy that seemed to be from Japan but had no idea what Japan was. He asked for a country that didn't exist, and of all the things he doesn't know what a quirk is? Inko was very confused here, but she could see the look on Lee's face. He looked as if he really didn't know anything. She could see he looked confused and lost. She took a deep breath, and she and Lee would walk somewhere privately. They went to a cafe. Lee had never been inside of one before. Well, at least not one this fancy. They stopped and she ordered coffee. In the meantime, she also called the police about the muggers. As Lee and Inko sat together, she would allow Lee to explain his story. Lee would take a deep breath and he would tell her about everything. He would tell her about the Hidden Leaf Village, of his friends. He would tell her of his life as a shinobi, about how he was born without ninjutsu or genjutsu, and how the only thing he had to his name was taijutsu, and he was training to be the best taijutsu user in the world. All of this sound way too far-fetched to be true. But then again, Inko had to stop and think to herself. She lived in a world where, only less than 100 years ago, superpowered beings didn't exist either, and through some freak phenomenon it was now a possibility. I mean, was interdimensional travel really impossible? All the same though, she would warn Lee not to go around telling everyone about that. Lee wondered why, and she would explain that there were some people who were dangerous, people who might try to use him for their own ends, and that he should only tell people this if he really feels he can trust them. Like her. Lee would nod understandingly, and they would enjoy their beverages. Of course, he still didn't know very much about anything here. I mean, if everything he said was true, he was basically in another world. He had no records, no ID, no nothing, except his name and his birthday and his age, and his weird set of powers. Whatever they weren't quirks, but they were something supernatural. They weren't sure of what they should do. What could they do? Except Inko would have one idea. She would call her local school, asking if she could bring someone over who needed help and assistance, a young man with nowhere to go. Her school agreed, and she helped Lee get there. She couldn't stay for too long as she really did need to get home, but she was grateful to Lee. Before leaving, though, they had a conversation. Lee had his own set of questions. Inko couldn't explain everything, but she did explain what quirks were, something that most people were born with, although some people were quirkless in this world after all. How a quirk was basically like a superpower, like whatever he was doing. And that there were heroes and there were villains. Lee was able to get the gist of it, and he also heard in passing her talking about how kids go to different schools to train and hone their abilities. Of course, for her, she had thought about doing the hero course thing, but she didn't think she was strong enough, and even if she were, there was no way she could get into a top school like UA. That was for people who were the best of the best, and she didn't think she'd be anything like that. But Lee didn't like that kind of talk. He always wanted to encourage people to do their very best, to truly push and go beyond their limits. Inko would kind of laugh and say that was kind of the front alma mater for the school that she had heard of, UA. It was basically their quota to go beyond, to go plus ultra. And Lee kind of liked that saying. He liked the idea of pushing himself to the absolute limit, to truly see what he was capable of. Once Lee was at the school, he would speak to a few adults, and he would carefully try to explain the situation. Remembering what Inko told him, he would basically explain that he had nowhere to go. No ID, nothing at all. He tried to explain where he were from, but they couldn't make any idea of it. They had absolutely no profiles, no data, nothing on him at all. They asked if he had a quirk, and he would have to shake his head no, but he was capable of doing other things. They asked what it was exactly, and Lee wasn't sure of how to explain it, so he focused chakra into his feet and moved really fast, all around the room. They assumed that it was super speed, but he said that he could do things with super strength also. They asked how he was doing this if he really didn't have a quirk, and he said that he just used chakra and taijutsu. Now, in this world, there were things like chakra and ninjutsu, but no one believed that it could really amount to anything like this, not compared to a quirk. But if what he was doing was truly not connected to a quirk, then this was a lot more complicated than they thought. The school would make some phone calls, and they would keep Lee there for a while, and eventually some representatives from UA would arrive, picking up Lee and taking him to the school. There, the other teachers and staff, some heroes and some just looking to teach and being retired, they would give Lee a quick set of tests to see what he can do. They were able to see his skills firsthand, and they were absolutely floored at what they were seeing. I mean, if they didn't know any better, they thought they had found the next All Might, and they never thought they would find another All Might. I mean, this was amazing. And this kid really didn't have anywhere to go. It was a good thing they found him when he did. There was no telling what would have happened if some villain had found him by some chance. I mean, if this kid could potentially be All Might and he fell into the wrong hands, that could make him dangerous. Lee would be sat down by the staff of UA High, and they would tell him that in 10 months' time, there was going to be an entrance exam. The school would personally fund his room and board, a nice apartment for him to stay at. They would help get him proper identification and teach him anything he might be missing. They asked what type of education he had. Lee knew the basic things, reading, writing, arithmetic. He wasn't illiterate, and thankfully he could read the language here, so he wasn't dumb, but he was just from a place where they did things rather differently. Well, you could just say that Lee was built different compared to this world, where kids were trained and groomed a lot more for a dangerous life. I mean, by the time Lee had graduated from his academy, he was basically a part of his country's own military, in a sense, so the idea of giving his life to save and protect wasn't really a foreign concept to him. But still, they were impressed, and they believed that UA could be the right place for him, and they were willing to let him go to the entrance exam, full ride. He didn't even have to apply. But Lee wanted to, since he felt that would be only fair. But he also had another request, and that was that there was someone that he knew, a girl. He knew that she had been thinking about going here, and he would only come if they gave her a chance. Just an invitation. The school thought it over, and they figured having one person couldn't hurt, and they could see what she could do. He gave her the name, and that was done. Not too long after, Lee's living arrangements was set up. A basic apartment, simple appliances, nothing too dramatic. Basically everything he had at home in his old life, so he knew how things worked, although he still had to learn about the ins and outs of this world. He learned briefly about the history of Japan, any questions that he might have, learning about this new country, and about the other ones around the world. Places like the United States, and places in Europe, and other countries and continents like Asia, and places like Russia and Africa, and things of that caliber. It was definitely a lot to take in, and Lee would have a long way to go in terms of learning world history, but he was able to get the gist of things. He had his original shinobi uniform, still intact. He would store it away in his closet. He believed he would use it one day, but he wasn't sure when. In the meantime, he went to go find that girl. He wasn't sure where he'd find her, but he figured he'd find her someday. He put on a tracksuit that he got instead, and he just went out jogging. He figured jogging around the city would be a good way to clear his mind. He started in the morning, and he somehow found himself running all around Japan without getting tired at all. Granted, he had done a lot worse running in the Hidden Leaf, so this was nothing new to him either. And by chance that afternoon, he actually did find her. She were walking in the park, not really thinking very much of anything. In fact, Inko wondered if she would ever see Lee again. She had to tell him the news. She had somehow gotten a letter to go to the UA entrance exam, but she had no idea she would even be accepted. Of course, it didn't take long for their reunion to come, as he would yell out to her rather quickly. Once he did so, the two of them would reunite with one another, and Lee would explain what happened. Of course, Inko was grateful, but she was still hesitant. After all, her quirk was nothing special, really. Her quirk didn't even have a name. It was just attraction of small objects. She could pull small objects to her. That was it. But for Lee, he looked at it a lot differently. He had seen how these quirks worked. Looking on TV and even out in the streets, he saw how villains and heroes acted. He figured if a quirk was anything like a muscle, it was something you needed to train and build up. You couldn't just let it fall to the wayside. It could have potential, but she had to be willing to put the work in. And Lee offered to teach her. This caught Inko's interest after all. I mean, Lee was definitely capable from what she had saw in the alleyway. But he didn't have a quirk, so what would he know exactly? Of course, anything would be better than failing, and this was an opportunity to get into a pristine school. And after all, if she could get in, she didn't have to take the hero course forever. She could do general studies or even marketing if she wanted to. This was an opportunity. Hesitantly, she would agree, and Lee would agree to train her. They had 10 months to prepare, and for Lee, he felt that that would be more than enough time. Their training started rather slow. Rock Lee got a good understanding of her quirk, learning exactly what she could and couldn't do. She could basically pull small objects towards her, that was all. Nothing more, nothing less. Lee would test this out by throwing a few small stones at her. She was able to catch them in midair and pull them towards her. From what he could see, how effective she was with her quirk was in comparison to her physical strength. She didn't seem all that strong, and it seemed to reflect in her quirk. So that's when they started with building up strength and endurance. They would spend the first 2 months working on her overall strength, doing basic things like light jogging and some weightlifting, and some deep meditation. After around 2 months, Inko saw her quirk improve. She was able to pull slightly larger objects like bigger rocks, and she could even move a chair across the room. It wasn't anything big, but it was definitely a major improvement. As they continued on in their training, after 4 months had passed, Inko's power had increased tenfold. While in her house, she could actually move the office desk across the room. Of course, she had to stop as she pulled it a little too close towards her. And she thought one day she was even able to pull a small car. Nothing big, maybe like a Volkswagen Beetle or something like that. And that was the limit, really. Although anything else, it really wasn't all that effective. But still, she had seen major growth. Lee was definitely a good motivator for Inko. He was always so kind and encouraging. Even though he was stronger than her and he could have easily have been a drill sergeant, he was always soft and sweet, always trying to pick her up whenever she fell down. He had a never give up type of attitude, and it was infectious. He always believed in his springtime of youth, and that now more than ever, he wanted to push himself and be the very best that he could be. One day while they were training, Lee had gotten an idea. He had been at home and he had some magnets on his refrigerator, and he saw how the magnets worked. He was fully aware of magnetism, and he knew how magnetism could attract and repel also. That was when he came up with an idea. He asked Inko if she ever considered pushing her power out. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but he explained. She seemed to be able to attract things to her naturally, but did she ever try repelling things? That idea never crossed her mind. She didn't think it was possible. After all, when she was born, this was all she could do. But Lee would explain that maybe there was more to her skills. Like there was another gear that she just wasn't tapping into. They would give it a try. Lee would take a small pile of stones, and he would softly toss them towards her from a safe distance. They wouldn't do any harm, but she would get hit by them if she couldn't block them away. And in the first few weeks, she got hit by a lot of stones. She would, instead of trying to pull, she would try to push. But it wasn't really working, or at least so she thought. Deep within her, her quirk was starting to evolve. You see, unlike in the original universe, where Inko, instead of truly pushing herself in training to see what her quirk could really do, she basically always stayed stagnant. If I had to describe it best, Inko's quirk was essentially something that never got a chance to blossom. It was like a plant seed that was never planted. It basically always remained a seed. And even if she did plant it, she didn't give it enough sunlight and water. But Lee was that sun. He was the thing that nurtured her, that pushed her, that made that flower grow into something greater. And just 2 more months had passed, and she slowly started to see the change. At first, all the stones didn't hit her. A few of them stopped midway, and then a lot of them stopped. And then eventually, it got to a point where they couldn't get halfway across the line before she was sending them back. And this was the improvement that Lee was hoping for. Now she was starting to see that she could do more. Not just attract, but repel. They would change her exercise a bit. She would focus on repelling and attracting. She would take a single rock, and Lee would throw it in the air. There would be a line in the sand on the beach where they trained. Her training every day was to push the rock across the line, back and forth, and never let it hit the ground. It was a strain mentally. It took a lot of focus. It took a lot of effort, and sometimes it was hard to maintain. But slowly she started to get the hang of it. Pretty soon, she had rocks moving and flowing all around her. She was able to push them in and out, able to bring them close and repel them at will. It was like she had a switch inside of her, a switch that could be flipped and she could go either way, repel or attract. She was a living magnet, in a sense. On top of doing that, Lee also helped her improve in other areas. He would help her be able to use the items that she was able to use telekinetically, and she used her telekinesis for target practice. She would take a pile of stones and she would line up a set of cans. Without touching them, she would lift them with her mind and shoot the cans with the stones. At first, her aim wasn't all that good, but thankfully, aim was something that a ninja was good at. And with more practice, her aim got better and better. Eventually, as 8 months had gone by, she had a good hold on her quirk. She couldn't do anything major. I mean, she wasn't lifting and throwing cars, but she could lift, bring, and repel decent-sized objects. She had crafted out these specially made stones. They were about the size of golf balls. She could float them in the air and move them at will all around. Essentially, she used these tiny balls like they were floating around her, like she were a planet itself, and she was able to use them at will. In her training with Rock Lee, Lee would practice dodging her attacks, and in turn, she also gained something else. Lee decided to introduce her to sparring, teaching her basic taijutsu for a good form of self-defense in case anyone ever got too close. And pretty soon, she was able to hold her own defensively. Of course, she was nowhere near Rock Lee in terms of skill, but in terms of having a little light sparring, that was good enough for her. Eventually, the 10 months of training would come to an end, and the day of the entrance exam would be underway. Both Lee and Inko arrived to UA, and they both wished each other good luck. When it came to the written part of the exam, Lee, he barely passed. He was good physically in a lot of ways, but when it came to book smarts, he was decent. And a lot of the stuff that was on this test was stuff that he really wasn't all that familiar with. But thankfully, Inko proved to be helpful in that regard, being a tutor for him the last 10 months. He was able to get a decent passing grade, and once they had finished the written part of the exam, They made their way to the open area, a city simulation, if you will, where they would be taking the second part of the exam. This was where Lee got to shine. The both of them would be in the same area, and they both looked at each other. Inko had her bag with several stones placed inside to use them as her weapons. Lee would crouch down and get ready. When the caller gave the mark for them to go, Lee was the first one out of the gate. He rushed towards the robots that were inside the city. They were aware that they would get different points for each robot that they defeated. The smallest one was 1 point, the medium size was 2, and the large was 3. There was a large one above them all, the 0 pointer though. That one didn't give them any points, and it was something they needed to stay clear of. This was now a chance for Lee to cut loose and see what he could do. He wasn't sure if his body was really at 100% or if he were just being played with. But he took a deep breath, and he would open the first 2 of the 8 inner gates, the gate of opening and the gate of rest. His speed increased twofold. He was effortlessly destroying the robots with ease, kicking and ripping them apart limb from limb. Inko was absolutely amazed, and the staff and the proctors were absolutely stunned to see what he could do. And on his paper, he was written down as quirkless. There was no way this guy could be quirkless. He was moving around in there like he was All Might. And there was a certain hero who had stopped by to see this for himself. And he had to admit, he was impressed. As Lee continued on moving ahead, Inko would carefully pick her targets. She would use her smaller stones to be used as projectiles, shooting them in and out of the robot's joints where it was the most vulnerable, taking down bunches at a time with ease. They were slow and steady, and it took a lot of work, but it was effective for her. She was moving along at a nice and even pace, and everything was going fine, and she had even racked up a decent amount of points, not just in combat, but also, unknown to her, in rescue, as she had helped a few other students who had gotten trapped under some debris. She focused her quirk and used it to be able to move the larger objects out of the way, helping them to safety. However, when she didn't see it coming, a large 0-pointer robot cornered her. She tried to use her quirk to fight back and escape, but it proved to be useless. Lee had taken a break in the distance, but he saw what was about to happen. The large 0-point robot looked like it was about to crush her. Even some of the staff were worried that something might happen, and All Might was getting ready to jump loose when a flash of green came out of nowhere. It was Lee moving at top speed. He swooped in and picked her up before moving her out of the way of safety. Again, everyone was absolutely stunned. That maneuver wiped them out a little bit. Using the inner gates was still a drawback for him. He felt himself being extremely tired, but he was glad to see that Inko was alright, and she was happy and thanked him. Eventually, the exam would come to an end, and Recovery Girl would go out and heal anyone who was hurt or tired. Not too long after, both Inko and Lee would get the news that they had gotten into UA, and they were both going to be a part of the Hero Academia. The two of them were extremely excited to start their lives together as heroes. Over the years, Lee and Inko would both improve, and they would be the standouts of their graduating class. Lee would adopt his own hero name. He would go by Hirudora, the Taijutsu hero. His hero costume was actually his Hidden Leaf uniform, but instead of wearing sandals, he replaced them with combat boots with iron soles that would be more effective. He also had a special vest made, one similar to that of those worn in the Hidden Leaf, in honor of those whom he fought beside, a lot similar to his master, Might Guy. He also had shuriken holsters built, carrying kunais and throwing stars, and a few other weapons, although his favorite outside of the kunai and shuriken were the nunchaka, something that he become akin to using when he trained with his sensei. And as for Inko, she came up with her own hero costume. This one is actually a lot similar to the one that Midoriya uses, although it's a lot more green and white. And her hero name was Miss Magnetism, the Magnet Hero. Her suit was adorned with small but dense pieces of metal. She was able to use them and to be able to repel and fly herself in the air with ease, as well as being able to repel and shoot out any object she wished. Her quirk eventually did hit a limit though. She wasn't able to lift extremely large things, but things of decent size. A car here or a truck there could be moved, as well as helping move debris. While she was a hero, she mostly stuck to doing rescue and recovery, although she could fight a villain if she needed to. She was also well adept in taijutsu, thanks to Rock Lee. Eventually, like any story between two young individuals who remain close long enough, they eventually grew not only in popularity, with Rock Lee's popularity catching up to the point where he was even ranked among the top heroes of Japan, including All Might and Endeavor himself. But eventually their love also grew as well. And a few years down the line, when Lee was 27 and Inko was 25, he popped a question and asked her to marry him. It was going to be an obvious yes, and the two of them were married, becoming a crime-fighting family, and growing together. But there were trying times as well. It would become known as the incident. It started when Inko learned that she was pregnant. She wanted to find a way to tell Lee, but before she even got the chance, there was a massive catastrophe, one that had never been seen before. She and Lee were one of the top heroes in Japan, along with the others, and they were the first one dispatched on the scene. Inko would help with recovery, helping to move heavy debris and escorting civilians to safety. In the meantime, Lee would go to the front lines to see what was happening. And what he saw that day would change him for the rest of his life. He would join All Might fighting against a villain known as All for One. Lee had no way of describing this, but this was a man of pure evil, someone not to be trifled with. After all his years of training, Lee eventually learned how to break through and tap into the seventh of the 8 inner gates, the Gate of Shock, along with All Might, who was using One for All to its fullest extent. The two of them worked together, dealing a critical blow and defeating All for One. However, in the process, the both of them were dealt fatal wounds, and both of them were rushed to the hospital. Inko was extremely worried, and when she learned what had happened to Lee, she had to keep a straight face and continue her duty, although the fate of her husband weighed heavy on her mind. Eventually she would arrive and Lee was in surgery. His lower abdomen had been completely crushed, and it took everything for them to be able to undo the damage that had been done, but even then, there was no telling how many lasting effects that would last. And it didn't help that he used the inner gates the way that he did. You see, Lee had to be careful using this power. In this world, unlike the one that he had come from, even with their advancements in medicine and science, They didn't know how to deal with someone who used chakra. They didn't know how to fix the chakra network. A man whose ability basically ripped his muscles over and over again, pushing the human body to certain limits that the human body was simply never meant to be pushed to. This event was definitely dark, and one that was never even put on the records. For All Might, his time as being a hero had been reduced. Whenever he wasn't in his buff form, he had to be in his skinny form. And as for Lee, while his injuries were eventually healed, he was warned that if he continued to use a type of power to that extent over and over again, his body was simply going to break down. If he kept putting it through that much punishment and torment, he was cutting off years of his life the more he did so. And if he wasn't looking at early retirement, he might be looking at death. For some time, this worried Inko and Rock Lee. But they were able to work through it. And they had a reason to be joyful. For not too long after, their son would be born. His name would be Izuku Lee Midoriya. Through the event of their marriage, Lee had taken the last name Midoriya, since it was Inko's last name. He became Ryoku, or Rock Lee Midoriya, for short. As for their son, he grew up idolizing heroes. Of course, he was a fan of All Might like anyone else, but there was one person who was his hero more than anyone, and that was his father. He learned from an early age that his father was quirkless, and yet he was a hero on par with All Might. It made him proud, like he had a lot to live up to. Even as a young child, when he got the unfortunate news that he was born without a quirk, his mother and himself, they weren't all that worried. Of course, Inko wished that her son could have had a quirk at least like hers so that she could train him a bit more, but they could always do martial arts training together. And after all, look at who the boy's father was. It was Hirudora, one of the more powerful heroes in Japan, and he was quirkless. So there wasn't that much to worry about, but she had her concerns. While Izuku grew up in a loving home, having superheroes as parents, there were some trying times. They would be gone on missions or doing hero work, and sometimes Deku would have to be dropped off at his friend's house, Katsuki Bakugo. He had gotten the name Deku because, well, that was what Bakugo called him as an insult. Although they were friends, he proved to be kind of a jerk. Even at a young age, Bakugo, when he got his quirk, always liked to put him down. He would always say mean things, even saying that All Might was better than his dad. But Izuku was always proud of his father. He had inherited his will of fire, his fighting spirit to stand up for what he believed in. And what he believed in most was being a hero in spite of his flaws. He wanted to be every bit of the hero that his father was, not just All Might. And that was the standard he set himself to be. No matter how many times Bakugo put him down, he would always get back up. At around 8 years old, Lee would begin training Izuku, teaching him how to manipulate his chakra. Eventually, he was able to teach him some things, but there were some other things that he couldn't teach him, and this did make him feel bad. For all he knew, Izuku could probably use ninjutsu or genjutsu if he wanted to, but he couldn't teach him anything because he didn't have the ability to use it. Although he did know one thing that could certify that. As a young child, they had done a test in school to see if anyone had a chakra affinity. Lee had to funnel chakra into a leaf, and based on what happened to the leaf, then it would determine what his affinity was. Even though Lee didn't have one, he wanted to see if Izuku had one at least. He would take a leaf from a tree and give it to his son, and he would tell his son to focus and try to push his chakra into the leaf. Izuku would concentrate and do as his father asked, and when he did, the leaf would crinkle up like it was crumbled paper. This confirmed that his son had lightning release. Of course, what he could do with it, he wouldn't know, but at the very least it confirmed that his son could do something more. Maybe there was a power that he could tap into somehow, some way. The years would go by, and Izuku would continue to train in taijutsu along with his father. He also learned how to do things like walking up trees and walking on water as well, learning to improve in his stealth and other ninja skills. The father and son duo would play hide and seek, where Izuku would have to hide very carefully and avoid being detected by his father. As they continued to train and grow closer, Lee could see that his son was improving in many areas, even when it came to using his taijutsu. Of course, he had never taught his son to use the inner gates, at least not yet. He didn't feel the boy was ready for that. But it was getting very close to that time. As Izuku's middle school years were coming to an end, the teacher would remark that it was getting time for them to decide what high schools they were going to want to go to. But of course, the teacher threw his hands up in the air since he already knew many of them wanted to go down the hero course, and that 2 of the students had applied to UA, that being Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Lee Midoriya. Of course, this was no surprise to anyone. Over the last few years, Bakugo and Izuku's rivalry had taken a whole new level. Izuku was quirkless, but he wasn't weak. And unlike before, he was not afraid to stand up to Bakugo. They would spar constantly. Even though Bakugo held the edge in terms of having an explosive quirk, he always had to be on guard because this martial arts fighting loser just never knew when to back down, and he could throw one hell of a right hook. Eventually the school day would come to an end, and Deku decided to take the short way home. Walking under an alleyway, he would come into contact with a sludge villain that tried to take over his body. However, the sludge villain would be in for a surprise, as Izuku was able to use his ninja-like abilities to escape and evade its attacks. His increased strength and speed, he was able to capture half of it into an empty bottle. When out of nowhere, All Might would show up, saving him in the nick of time from the rest of the sludge villain. He would help put it in the other jar as well. He had noticed his moves, and if he didn't know any better, he thought he was looking at Lee. He knew that Lee had a son, and he wanted to confirm whether or not if that was him. All Might would ask if his father was the legendary taijutsu hero Hirudora, and Lee would shake his head in awe, confirming it. He had heard stories about how his father and All Might had worked together, but to actually meet All Might here, out of nowhere, that was truly amazing. Of course, All Might couldn't stay for too long, but he told him that he did sign his hero book. Before leaving though, Izuku would ask All Might if he could be a hero, even like him. If he could one day make it all the way to the top, even if he didn't have a quirk. All Might would simply laugh and tell him he was the son of Rock Lee. Of course he could. And with that, he would take the sludge villain as he flew off, taking him to the police. And with that, Izuku, now more confident and determined than ever, would head home, although his mom and dad wouldn't be there. For you see, they were at the hospital. Lee was getting his yearly checkup, and there were warning signs. His body was breaking down. He had put it through absolute hell in his hero career. And the more he pushed himself, well, the worse his condition got. The best case scenario, he might be looking at early retirement. Worst case scenario, it could be death. Even as a young man, Rock Lee always knew that his power, the Hidden Lotus, it was a double-edged sword. In fact, to use the 8 inner gates, one could obtain the ultimate power, but at the cost would be one's own life. Inko would stand next to her husband, worried. She had always looked out for Lee and his well-being, and the last thing she wanted was to lose him, for her son to lose his father. But Lee would assure her that everything would be fine. On the way home, they questioned whether or not they should tell Izuku about this. But Lee would tell her that there was no need to do so, at least not now. After all, nothing bad had happened to him, and everything seemed to be relatively fine. So, they were good in the meantime. When they arrived home at dinner, Deku would be very happy talking to his family, telling them about how excited he was to enter into UA like they did, and that he hoped that he could be a great hero like them. He looked up to his father, smiling with pride, and Lee looked back at him. Looking at him, he remembered the young baby that he held in his arms the day that he was born. He remembered how much pain he was in. He was still recovering from his fight with All for One, and from the effects of the inner gates. But he remembered when he was holding the two of them close. He remembered holding his wife and his child. And that was all the motivation that he needed. As Izuku would look up to his father, asking him if he could train him and get him ready, Lee would simply look at his son and give him a big smile, telling him that he was going to be more than ready when the time came, and that he was proud of him, no matter what. And with that, Izuku's story would begin. The son of the greatest taijutsu martial artist who ever lived. This is his story of how he would go on, while quirkless, to become the greatest hero that the world had ever seen. This concludes What If Deku Was the Son of Rock Lee? My Hero Academia Fighting Spirit Part 1. As always, if you enjoyed today's video, then please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can always stay up to date on everything that is PowerCore Productions and Podcastings that has to come out now and in the future. And stay tuned as we have more coming out this week and in the time to come. But anyway, that's going to do it for you in today's video. I'm Javon Harrington with PowerCore Productions and Podcastings. Signing off, and I'll see you next time.